A quiet warning from an NBA insider just turned into fuel for one of the most intriguing trade discussions around Boston. And it is not about panic, desperation, or patchwork fixes. It is about timing, leverage, and the kind of patience that separates smart contenders from reckless ones. When Brian Windhorst made it clear that Ivica Zubac is not available under any circumstance, it sounded like a door being slammed shut. But listen closer, and the message is far more revealing. This was not just a denial, it was a signal. A signal about how the league views Boston, how rival front offices are bracing themselves, and how the Celtics are positioning for something bigger than a short-term upgrade. The surface-level reaction is easy. Zubac is productive, he is efficient, his numbers jump off the page. But the real story is not about what Zubac does on the court. It is about why Boston is not rushing toward that profile, even after losing front-court depth. The Celtics are not hunting for a traditional solution. They are scanning for a structural advantage that can reshape multiple seasons, not just one playoff run. The Clippers sitting near the bottom of the West might look like an invitation. In reality, it is a test of discipline. Their refusal to sell tells us something important. Other franchises know Boston has flexibility. They know Boston has assets. And they know Boston is dangerous when it waits. Here is the uncomfortable opinion that few fans want to hear, and even fewer analysts will say out loud. Boston does not need to win the trade deadline to win the future. In fact, making the wrong splash right now could slow down the exact advantage they are quietly building. This is not about downgrading expectations, it is about aligning them. With Tatum's recovery resetting timelines, the Celtics have the rare luxury of evaluating big man markets without emotional pressure. That opens doors to players who are not even available yet, players whose situations could flip with one injury, one ownership decision, or one playoff collapse elsewhere. Names like Turner, Vucevic, or even Anthony Davis float around because they represent different trade philosophies: spacing versus physicality, short-term impact versus long-term leverage. What nobody is saying clearly enough is that Boston is not choosing between those players today. Boston is choosing which version of the NBA it wants to attack next. Monday night in Boston felt different from the opening tip. The rotation was tight, the minutes were heavy. The urgency was unmistakable. This did not look like a random December game. It looked like a stress test, and the Pistons unknowingly delivered Brad Stevens a reminder that could shape everything about this trade season. Joe Mazzulla coached with playoff instincts. Jaylen Brown pushed to a season-high workload. Derek White stayed glued to the floor. The starting five opened the fourth quarter together, a choice that screamed intention rather than desperation. Boston wanted to know something about itself, and it wanted that answer against the most physical team it could find at the top of the East. And then came the tension. Detroit did not blink. They hit first. They absorbed contact. They forced decisions at uncomfortable speed. For long stretches, the game slowed into a grind where every possession felt expensive. The scoreboard mattered, but the real story lived in the margin. Live ball turnover, bench reaction. Who could survive when space disappeared? This is where the curiosity gap widened. The obvious takeaway would be shooting percentages or the final score. That is surface level. The deeper takeaway is far more important for Boston's future. This roster, when stripped down to its core, can match elite physicality without losing its identity. That matters more than a December win. Derek White said the quiet part out loud. Sometimes shots do not fall. Sometimes pressure forces misses. Sometimes basketball is simply unforgiving. The Celtics lived through all three and never lost their structure. That is not a flaw. That is a foundation. Even the rotation decisions late in the game tell a hopeful story. Trust was placed where reliability mattered most. That is how playoff teams are built, not by fantasy depth charts, but by understanding which roles survive contact and chaos. This loss also reframed expectations without lowering them. Boston is closer to the top of the East than the standings suggest, closer than most rivals want to admit. When fully locked in, they already belong in these games. The next step is not reinvention, it is refinement. And that is the reminder Brad Stevens just received. Trade season is not about chasing noise. It is about answering questions raised in games like this. Who holds up when it turns physical? Who needs support where one move can unlock multiple lineups. What if the most misunderstood piece on Boston's roster is actually the key that unlocks their next great move? As the trade market quietly wakes up, one name keeps floating through front office conversation, not because of failure, but because of timing. Anthony Simons is no longer just a player in the rotation. He is a mechanism, and that distinction changes everything about how the Celtics can shape their future. December 15th does not just open the trade window, it changes leverage. Contracts signed in the summer suddenly become tools instead of commitments. For Boston, that shift matters more than it does for almost anyone else in the league. Simons sits at the center of that moment, not as a problem, but as an opportunity hiding in plain sight. Here's where the curiosity gap begins. Most discussions around Simons stop at fit, minutes, usage, shot attempts. That is the obvious layer. The deeper layer is far more interesting. His expiring contract gives Boston something extremely rare in this market: flexibility without desperation. Teams chasing playoff positioning value that kind of salary slot more than fans realize, especially when they need to rebalance their books without committing long-term money. Simons has not failed in Boston. His role has simply been squeezed by circumstance. The Celtics do not need volume scoring from the guard spot right now. They need lineup stability, defensive continuity, and optionality for when the season bends toward physical playoff basketball. That does not make Simons expendable in a negative sense. It makes him valuable in a strategic one. And this is where Brad Stevens enters the picture. Around the league, expiring contracts are being treated like lifeboats. Some teams want to shed money. Others want to reset timelines without admitting it publicly. Boston can walk into those conversations without pressure because they are not forced to act. That patience is power. From a basketball standpoint, Simons remains productive. He can score in bursts. He can create offense when defenses tighten. But his true value to Boston may never show up in a box score. It shows up in trade call, in matching salary, in making deals legal that would otherwise die in the first minute of discussion. The potential return of Jason Tatum adds another layer that makes this moment fascinating. When your superstar comes back, roles compress even further. Suddenly, the idea of reallocating resources becomes logical rather than emotional. Not because Boston is giving up on anyone, but because championship windows demand ruthless clarity. What if the loudest trade idea connected to the Celtics right now is actually the one they are smartest to ignore? As the deadline inches closer, the noise around Boston is getting louder, but not sharper. Every season brings one proposal that sounds perfect on the surface and quietly dangerous underneath. The latest Miles Turner idea fits that pattern almost too well, and that is exactly why Brad Stevens is unlikely to bite. At first glance, the logic feels tempting. A proven big, floor space, interior defense, a name that sparks instant reactions across the league. But this is where the curiosity gap opens, because the real decision facing Boston has very little to do with Turner as a player, and everything to do with timing, leverage, and long-term control. Here is the part that rarely gets discussed publicly. Taking on a long-term contract at this moment reshapes the next 4 years, not just the next 4 months. Turner's cap number would not simply exist in isolation. It would compress flexibility at the exact moment Boston is preparing to reopen it. This is where Stevens' thinking becomes fascinating. The front office built this roster with optionality in mind: short-term scoring support, long-term financial relief. The idea was never to replace one expiring deal with another multi-year commitment of similar size. Doing so would defeat the entire purpose of the current setup. And yet, the league keeps pushing the idea anyway. Why? Because teams around the NBA want Boston to blink. They see a conference without a runaway favorite. They see a superstar return on the horizon. They want Boston to believe the moment demands aggression. But smart contenders know that leverage increases when you do not rush. Boston does not need to chase control of the East by February. Control can come through patience, through waiting for the market to tilt, through letting other teams feel pressure first. When that happens, prices change. Structures change, conversations reopen. Avoiding this trade is not passivity, it is positioning. The Celtics are protecting their ability to strike when the right deal appears. Not just the loudest one. They are preserving cap space, internal development, and lineup adaptability for a moment that may not even exist yet in public discourse. That is how elite front offices operate. They say no to good ideas, so they can say yes to great ones. So while the Miles Turner concept will continue to circulate, the smarter read is this. Boston sees something beyond the proposal, something longer, something cleaner, something that does not force them to mortgage flexibility for optics.